You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Good morning, I'm Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi.
And I'm Jason Szilagyi with today's Caffeinated History with the Szilagyis on the BQN Podcast Collective.
Before we jump into our topic for the day, we'd like to take a moment to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make our show possible. Listeners, you can hear your name listed as one of our associate producers with a monthly subscription of just $10 at patreon.com/BQN. And with a monthly subscription of $5 or more, you can join our meetings of the Hive Mind on the second Saturday of each month. Watch your Patreon messages for details. Today's topic is T. Thomas Fortune. The topic was inspired by the character appearing in HBO's The Gilded Age. Timothy Thomas Fortune was a journalist and civil rights leader in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was born into slavery in 1856 and freed by the Emancipation Proclamation at the age of 7. There is some question as to how much formal schooling he had. He did attend an elementary school in Marietta, Florida, and the Edwin M. Stanton School, a college prep school set up by the Freedmen's Bureau in Jacksonville, Florida, but he does not seem to have graduated. Fortune also worked as a page in the Florida State Senate, while his father was a member of the State Constitutional Convention and of the Florida House of Representatives from 1868 to 1870. He then attended Howard University, but left after a year to work at the People's Advocate, a black-owned newspaper in Washington, D.C. In 1879, he moved to New York City, working as a journalist and editor for the New York Globe. When the Globe closed in 1884, Fortune started his own paper, the New York Freedman, later the New York Age. He used his position to both advocate for integration and equal rights and to support African-American journalists and writers. The Freeman became the preeminent black paper of the time and featured work from such luminaries as Ida B. Wells, Gertrude Moselle, and W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1884, he published a book, Black and White, Land, Labor, and Politics in the South, in which he discussed issues confronted by the poor of all races. He believed the ultimate cause of the ills in society was the concentration of wealth. This caused poverty and slavery, whether it was the chattel slavery into which he had been born, or the industrial wage slavery inherent to the modern world. Fortune was also a founding member of the National Afro-American Council, which advocated for anti-lynching laws and to remove obstructions to voting for African Americans. Fortune was very particular about using Afro-American as an identifier, because it represented both, quote, one's African origin and American birth. The organization was also one of the first in the United States of any type to welcome women as equal members and to give them positions of leadership. The council was eventually overshadowed by other organizations, including the NAACP, but remains an important part of the civil rights movement of the era. Fortune continued as the editor of the New York Age until 1907, when a nervous breakdown prompted him to sell the paper. It remained a prominent voice in African American society until its closure in 1960. After selling the paper, Fortune wrote books about politics and education, as well as a collection of poetry. In 1923, he returned to journalism at the Negro World, for which he served as an editor until his death in 1928. Thank you for listening. We'd also like to thank our History with Szilagyis Patreon patrons, Pati, Susan Capuzzi-De Clerck, Laura Dell, Kris Hill, Betty Larsen, and Vince Locke. Their contributions help us to have the time to research and write what you're hearing. You can help us just like they do with a monthly subscription of as little as $3 at patreon.com/historywiththeszilagyis. Also, thank you to Mark White for the awesome show art and Zach Tripp for the wonderful closing music. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player, and don't forget to rate and review us there as well. And while you're at it, check out the rest of the great shows on the BQN Collective. We'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to reach out, you can find our network on Twitter at BQN Podcasts, and this podcast in particular at History Szilagyi. You can also talk about any and all of the BQN podcasts in our Facebook group, the BQN Collective. And last but not least, you can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at The Goddess Livia. That's TheGoddessLivia.
And me at Jason Dark Elf. We'd love to hear topic suggestions. What would you like to learn on Caffeinated History?